Oh baby, it's finally time to talk about inflation. Inflation is a fetish where— Silence! Your fetish is gross! Hey, no kink shaming. Kink shaming is my kink! SIMBIB. Hello folks, welcome back to Stuff I Make Because I'm Bored. My name is Sin and I will be your host, and welcome to part 2 of my quest to find somebody to blame for $5 bell peppers. Wait. What is this music that's playing? No, stop it! Turn that crap off! None of that inspirational Muzak BS! I am not becoming a financial YouTuber. For consistency, I'm going to focus my research on Canada and the US just like I did in part 1, when we discussed minimum wage increases and the effects that has on the cost of living. We learned that although it does cause a bit of inflation, it overall does not have that great of an effect on the cost of living, and so cannot be the target of my wrath. My hypothesis for this video is that inflation doesn't really have an effect on the cost of living at all. After all, it tracks the cost of living and how it has increased or decreased compared to the past, so how could it? That's just my theory, and I'm no economist, so I don't have that much knowledge about inflation. So let's dig in. Part 1. What is inflation? Inflation is the measure of purchasing power that money has in relation to the price of goods. For example, as groceries get more expensive, the volume of groceries you can get with the same amount of money decreases. This is inflation. Of course, there's also its opposite, deflation, where goods become cheaper and the power of money grows. But for some reason, we don't talk about that as often. You could track the inflation of a specific good or service, such as bread, but generally, economic inflation is tracked by following the change in the cost of goods from a variety of sources, including food, transportation, raw materials, and even services like healthcare, entertainment, and labor. A specific collection of these sources is called an index. There are 3 main indexes used to follow the inflation trends: the Consumer Price Index, CPI, which we touched on in part 1, the Wholesale Price Index, WPI, and the Producer Price Index, PPI. The Consumer Price Index is the most popular of these 3 indexes used to follow inflation, as it tracks the retail cost, aka the price paid by a customer or end user, of food, housing, utilities and furnishings, clothing, transportation, health and personal care, recreation, education, and alcohol, tobacco, and recreational cannabis. These are all elements that make up the cost of living for an average citizen. And since it tracks the cost of living, the CPI is most often used to identify periods of economic inflation or deflation. The second most used index is the Wholesale Price Index, which follows the cost of goods and services before they reach a customer. It tracks the cost to transport raw materials to factories or finished goods to storefronts, etc. And the third index, the Producer Price Index, is sort of the WPI in disguise. It also follows the cost of finished goods bought at wholesale level, but where the WPI also includes goods and services that are counted in the CPI, such as rent, these are removed from PPI indexes in order to prevent a doubling up with the CPI when looking at inflation. You can kind of think of it like this. The CPI includes things like the cost of bread, movie tickets, a couch, and pants. Both the CPI and the WPI include costs like oil, gas, and rent, while the WPI and the PPI include costs like raw materials, government subsidies, export costs, producer profits, etc. Why are the WPI and the PPI so similar? Well, most of the world uses CPI and WPI to follow inflation trends. However, in 1978, the US renamed the WPI to the PPI and removed certain indexes to account for the double counting of certain items with the CPI. So now the US and some other countries, Canada included, thankfully, use PPI instead. What's useful about using these indexes to track inflation is that certain increases can be balanced out by other decreases. If we were to track the cost of just bread, and the price increased from $5 per loaf to $10 per loaf, that's an inflation rate of 200%. But if we take the cost of bread in combination with all groceries as a whole, we could see that though bread doubled in price, the cost of milk dropped from $8 to $4, and an apple from $3 to $2. So overall, the average person is still spending the same amount of money on the same groceries, meaning the inflation is actually 0%. Okay, cool, now we're experts on inflation indexes. Now let's see how they're used to calculate the core inflation percentages. The actual number for inflation, or core inflation, is decided by evaluating the trends of the CPI while accounting for some key factors. One such key factor is that sometimes the CPI can jump pretty extremely from one month to another due to some external forces. Let's take our bread example. Maybe the cost of bread doubled for a month because there was a plague of locusts that destroyed a pretty significant crop of wheat, and so the supply dropped significantly and the price increased because the demand stayed the same. If the cost of all other groceries also stayed the same, there would still be a pretty significant change in the overall CPI between the pre- and post-locust months. However, this isn't really an accurate point of actual inflation. The cost of wheat is a significant outlier here and should not be counted. Other factors could be changes in tax rates, severe weather, or hundreds of people blocking access to boats in order to prevent certain ships loaded with weapons from leaving the harbor. So inflation is actually calculated by selectively trimming specific indexes from the CPI or PPI in order to achieve a truer understanding of the actual overall rate of inflation. This is why in Canada, the CPI inflation rate of 2023 was 3.9%, while the core inflation was about 3.5%. Great, now we are experts on inflation indexes and inflation. But inflation is just something that happens to the economy. It's what happens when the cost of living changes. Nobody actually controls it, right? Part 2. Who controls inflation? While inflation trends are tracked using the CPI and PPI, its effects are actually moderated, through some capacity, by a country's central bank, because banks control the money supply of a country. A central bank is the central or main bank of a country. In the US, it's the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed, and in Canada, it's the Bank of Canada. While both of these entities work closely with the government and are supported by the government, they are not actually part of the government. In fact, according to the 1985 Bank of Canada Act, no board person of the Bank of Canada may hold any parliamentary position at all. According to this same act, it is the duty of EV to disrupt my recording. According to the same act, it is the duty of the Bank of Canada to, quote, regulate credit and currency in the best interest of the economic life of the nation, to control and protect the external value of national monetary unit, and to mitigate by its influence fluctuation in the general level of production, trade, prices, and employment so far as may be possible within the scope of monetary action, and generally to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada. Though the Bank of Canada is not in itself a part of the government, the governor of the bank is decided by the government and holds that seat for 7 years, and every 5 years the Bank of Canada and the government come together to decide the monetary policies that will govern decisions made by the bank for the next 5 years. The United States has a similar act to that of Canada, though theirs was established a little earlier in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act. This act created the Federal Reserve System, the Fed, which oversees 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, jointly responsible for promoting effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates, as well as providing a general oversight of the banks of the country. That worked out well. Unlike the Bank of Canada, the Fed has a board of 7 governors that is selected by the president and signed off on by the US Senate. New seats are staggered and elected one at a time every 2 years to minimize the political influence of the party currently at the helm of the states. And though it is independent from the government, it is still subject to following the fiscal policies set out by the government. Both of these central banks aim to act as independently as possible from their governments, wanting to act solely to target their 2% inflation targets without political influence. So how do they do this? Well, the economy relies on supply and demand. If somebody needs to sell 100 pies but they open their store just after lunchtime, they're gonna have very little demand for their product since everybody just ate. So in order to sell the pies anyway, they would need to set their prices very low to entice people to buy them. But if they open just before lunch, there will be very high demand because people will be hungry. And then they can raise their prices because people are buying something that they want or need. Central banks can also affect the supply and demand through various means. While the pie seller can only control their supply and their hours of operation, central banks have more influence over the customers and the money supply that they have. If the pie seller sets their prices really high, for example, and nobody has enough money to buy pies, the central bank can't force the pie seller to change their prices, but they can just create more money to give to the customers so they can buy the pie anyway. Problem solved. Well, it's not that simple. Just ask 1921 to 1923 Germany. Central banks aim to control inflation in one of 3 main ways: by changing the interest rates for banks, by buying government bonds or assets, and by changing the capital requirement rates. Setting the bank interest rates is pretty self-explanatory. The central bank sets the key interest rates for all banks and adjusts these interest rates to be higher or lower in order to control inflation. By making it lower, it encourages banks to give out more loans, and when they raise the interest rates, it discourages banks to give out loans. Therefore, they control how much money goes into the population. The second method, buying government bonds and assets, is a more direct way that the central banks can use to influence the economy. If the economy is in a more serious downturn, central banks can purchase specific government loans. These bonds are essentially an IOU from the government. The central bank gives the government a large amount of money with a set interest rate that the government will adhere to while paying back the money that they received. Simply put, it's kind of like a reverse loan. Who's willing to pay me $10? If you give me $10 right now, I will give you $15 in 2 weeks. Through buying these bonds, the central bank provides the government with the money that they need in order to enact specific policies, like through the first few years of the pandemic, where they provided rent relief and other monetary stimuli needed to keep the economy running. Commercial government bonds, which are not the same thing that central banks can buy, these are actually things that regular average Joes like you and I can buy, are actually one of the most stable investments that you can make. Tuck that one away for later. And the last thing that the central banks can do to affect inflation is that they set the national capital requirements for other banks. Capital requirement is the percentage of assets that a bank must keep in reserves to account for sudden changes in the economy, so that it can be liquefied in order to help in a crisis. By raising the capital requirements, banks are disincentivized to loan to citizens because they have to keep a higher amount of money on the premises, or actually available for them to use, which disincentivizes them to loan to citizens, thus reducing the amount of spending that happens and thereby reducing inflation, ideally. Cool. So, this is great. This means that somebody is controlling the rates of inflation directly, which also means that inflation can have an effect on the cost of living. It's not just a measure for what's happening to it. Part 3. Inflation and the cost of living. Well, the section's going to be quite short, isn't it? Because we sort of already answered this question. The central banks adjust the supply of money to the population, thereby increasing or decreasing the demand, and in exchange, the market does what the market does, and the supply changes to meet the demand. So, inflation does have an effect on the cost of living. But it's actually a good thing because it drives the cost down. Wait, hang on a second, that doesn't make any sense. Both the Fed and the Bank of Canada have a target for 2% inflation rates every year, and they step in to enforce those numbers by affecting the money supply of the country, meaning that every year they want the cost of living to rise by about 2%, which wouldn't matter if wages followed suit, but based on what we learned in my first video about minimum wage, wages for the poor, lower class, and pension citizens don't follow suit, meaning that the most vulnerable members of society are harmed by inflation. So I think I need to ask a different question. Part 3 again. Why 2%? I've looked up a bunch of articles on this, and the biggest arguments in favor of inflation are as follows. Line goes up. Yup. That's the only reason. Proponents in favor of consistent increases in costs claim that a constant low, and I do need to stress that, a low and steady amount of inflation of about 2% per year makes for a stable and forever growing economy. Consumers are more likely to purchase items now, instead of waiting and hoping that prices will go down, and their money then stimulates the economy. More money in the economy means more demand for products, which also means that companies will constantly experience higher profits, which means that they can afford to expand and hire more staff. All of this is generally a good thing. Besides, inflation is good because the opposite, deflation, is worse. Imagine if prices fell. Then companies would make less money and they would lay people off, increasing unemployment, which means less people spend money, which means companies make less money, etc., and it's a vicious downward spiral that will end in the destruction of everything. Imagine if housing prices dropped by 10%. Imagine. 10%. Can you imagine? Maybe I could afford a house before I die. And that's the end of their arguments in favor of inflation. But hear me out. If consumers are constantly expecting prices to rise, and therefore are buying now instead of waiting for prices to drop, then they have no time to invest their money into savings to save up for larger purchases at a later time. And if your wages don't go up following inflation, then you can put away less and less money into any kind of savings. The people who are able to make large purchases now are the people who are always able to make those purchases, regardless of inflation. Am I wrong? Am I missing something? People at the bottom of the economic ladder only suffer through inflation. Their wages don't go up, but their costs do. Their savings go down. Their standard of living suffers. And yet, inflation is good because line goes up. There's this economic theory called the Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon was an economist in the mid-1700s. He proposed that inflation, through its nature, cannot help the poor, or even the end consumer. It can only help those who are first affected by it. Remember earlier when I mentioned that government bonds are one of the most stable investments you can make? When the Fed or when the Bank of Canada announces their new inflation numbers, the very first people to take advantage of this are investment traders. They know that inflation causes people to want to buy stocks and bonds, so they rush to the market and within minutes, within seconds even, they buy up as many stocks and bonds as they can in anticipation of the prices to soar, making them the biggest benefactors of inflation. Then, when the companies who use investment traders sell large swaths of stock, they find themselves with a surplus of income and can make larger purchases faster due to low interest rates and invest in their own company, becoming the second benefactors of inflation. After that, other companies see the lower interest rates and also invest in themselves, but at a slightly higher cost because now there's more demand for the supply and the prices of goods are starting to rise, thus becoming the third benefactors of inflation. By now, the returns are already much lower than they were for the first groups, of course. Then, salary workers. They see that their money goes less far. The cost of everything has increased, and so they demand higher wages in order to maintain their standard of living. And even though they might get a raise, their relative income doesn't change that much at all, which makes them the receivers of the last dredges of the positive effects of inflation, which leaves the poor folks at the bottom with nothing. In fact, it leaves them with less. They lose. This is the Cantillon effect. Constant economic growth for the rich at the ever-growing cost to the poor. Part 4, Conclusion. Honestly, I don't really know what to say here for a conclusion. Initially, I just wanted to know what effects inflation had on the cost of living, and dare I say the effects are fairly low in normal years. About 2% per year, even. Those who control inflation even try to ensure that it doesn't get too out of hand over a short period of time, which, if inflation is inevitable, is for the most part a good thing. I would much rather deal with a 2% per year increase than a consistent 8% increase like we had in 2022. But if central banks can affect it accurately enough that they can consistently hit their target of about 2% per year, they must also be able to aim lower, right? But I guess they never will. It's like I said in part 1, the economy must grow. It must expand upwards forever. Companies are considered failures if the amount of money they made this year wasn't more than they made last year. Even if they made millions of dollars. Even if they made billions of dollars. Amazon made $554.028 billion last year. 554,028,000,000 last year. They grew 12.57% from last year. And even if they made exactly the same amount, $554.082 billion next year, they will be considered failures because they didn't grow. 554 billion. And it's not enough. It'll never be enough. I don't know what to do in regards to inflation. Like, sure, I like it when my pay increases, but what does that matter if my one-bedroom apartment costs me half my income for a month? if groceries for one person costs me almost $100 per week? If I barely make enough to put just $50 away per month into a tax-free savings account? When I set up that account, by the way, the advisor at my bank asked me what I was saving for. You know what I did? I laughed. Girl, what could I possibly be saving up for? A house? What are you smoking? And can I please have some? We will hit $1,000 per loaf of bread before anybody even thinks about potentially doing something that might affect the profits of the witch. And let's be honest, they probably won't even think about it then. Wow, okay, that one was a bit of a bummer. Sorry about that. Did I find the culprit for $5 bell peppers? Honestly, no, I guess I didn't, really. Sure, I discovered that at the trajectory that we've been set on, prices for bell peppers would have eventually hit $5, but proportionally at that point, accounting for inflation, it would have been the equivalent of them costing like $1 now. So what I learned is that constant growth is complete horseshit. Well, I already knew that, but I just have a newfound appreciation just for how thoroughly horseshit it actually is. So join me next time for a new dive into the truly terrifying depths of the economy. Or maybe not. I think I want to do something a little bit more lighthearted first. Did you guys know that the new upgraded Avatar series is releasing at the end of February? Can you believe they're calling it the better version? Why does everything have to be live action nowadays? People have no respect for animation. What factors do you think drive the cost of living to be so high? Do you have anything interesting you'd like me to do a deep dive on that is not related to the economy? Are you interested in the new Avatar series? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for spending some time with me. Leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. I post videos every Tuesday at noon Eastern. If you want to hear from me more often, you can follow me on all my social media accounts. You can find the ads here and in the description. But that's all for today, folks. I'll see you in the next video. Bye! SIMBIB, stuff I make because I'm bored. Can you believe that Evie picks right now, after having been quiet all day, to start making so much noise?